Hi, I'm Mike with Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to do a CA finish on a project handle. It's a super high gloss finish that's pretty durable and emphasizes the wood grain and makes your projects look great. There's a bunch of little nuances when you're doing a CA finish on a project handle this size. Doing pen blanks is a lot easier, but when you're doing a large project like this where it has complicated curves and shapes to it, I'll show you some of the tips and techniques I've learned over the years. On a piece of koa where it's naturally highly chatoyant, I wanted to emphasize that grain as well as having a finish that doesn't darken or discolor the wood as well. So ultra durable, super high gloss. I'll show you everything I've learned along the way. Let's get started. For this project handle, I'll be using a piece of box elder burl that I've dyed and stabilized. And if you want to learn how to stabilize your own blanks at home, we have another video we'll link to that you can check out. But this is some really high figured box elder burl. I've dyed this. It's the brilliant blue color, and it is stabilized for durability's sake and turnability. Stabilized woods turn better because it helps stiffen up the wood fibers, but it helps give it a really good color, and this will be a really nice piece to do a project handle with. So I've got this piece ready. First thing I want to do is make sure I get on my safety glasses. And this piece, the size of it right now won't fit in my chuck, so I'm going to turn this to round so we can fit it into our chuck. So I have my center points marked on each end so we can mount this between centers. We'll bring up our tailstock. Get that on our center point so we don't lose any material that we want to keep. So go ahead and snug your tailstock down. We'll set up our tool rest where we want it. Give it a quick spin to make sure that you're not contacting your tool rest. And then we'll be using our spindle roughing gouge just to rough this down to round. Anytime I start the lathe, I always stand off to the side just in case it comes out. And then I'll bring my lathe speed up to about 1800 RPM, and we can start rounding this out, getting the corners off. During the initial roughing process, that revolving center is going to kind of work its way into the piece of wood, so you might need to snug that up as you're turning a little bit. I'm going to adjust my tool rest over to the left slightly. When I'm using the spindle roughing gouge, I like to keep my hand over top of the tool just to keep the shavings under control. Alright, we'll bring this back over to this right side. Now that we're close to round, we'll bump that speed up quite a bit, about 2200 RPM. Alright, let's stop the lathe and take a look. Okay, we're almost around there. I'm going to take just a little bit more off and then that'll fit into our chuck just fine. Alright. Let's go ahead and take this off the lathe and we'll knock our centers out. So for the drilling part for this blank, I'm going to be mounting this in a VM100. This has the extended pin jaws. Alright, so I'm going to mount this in my chuck. Rotate that over just a little bit because I don't want to engage the jaws on the flat surface. That way I've got full contact all the way around. And then I like to tighten up both of those pinion gears. So I'm going to turn this on for just a second. Okay, the end of the blank is fairly square, but I'm just going to square that up real quick. I'll get my skew and just make sure that this face is completely flat. And then I have the dimple from the revolving center, but I'm going to clean that up and just make sure that that's running concentric for my drill bit. I'm going to take my revolving center out. We'll set this off to the side for just a second. But for this project handle, I'll be using the Ruth Niles insert. So for the drill bit size on this, I need a 27/64. I've got my center point already marked and cored out there for the drill bit to find center. But I'm going to be using the Ruth Niles insert. So I've got my 27/64 bit here in a keyless chuck, and I'll move my tool rest out of the way for just a moment. Make sure that your drill chuck is seated properly. And I want to show you guys a little trick I learned from Dick Singh. He's a professional woodturner, a good friend of mine. One thing, if your lathe centers are just a hair out of whack, one thing that helps when you're drilling is to leave your tailstock clamp loose. Let's turn our lathe on. So I've got my tailstock loose here, and then I'll advance the bit, and that's going to help the tailstock find its center point. From there, I'll lock it down, and now my bit's going to run nice and true, and I'm not going to have any outer round holes, and everything's going to be running a lot more concentric. So that's a great little tip from Dick Singh that he told me the other day. I've been using it ever since he told me. It's really helpful when you're drilling on the lathe. So I'm going to reduce my speed down for drilling to about 600 to 700 RPM. And then I'm going to snug up the quill just a little bit to take out some of the slop, but still be able to advance it. So anytime you're drilling, obviously reduce your speed. And when you first start drilling, make sure you advance that bit nice and slow. Make sure it's on center. Because if it's off center and you go and advance that in there, it's just going to get worse and worse as it progresses through the blank. Again, just slowly advance the bit. Make sure you back it out, especially on stabilized materials. The drill bit flutes tend to clog up a little bit quicker. I'm just going to mark where the bit was with my finger. Okay, and we're plenty far into the hole. So I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to show you guys another little tip I've learned. Anytime I drill this out for an insert or anything, even if I'm going to just be tapping this straight into the wood, I always like to fortify the drilled hole with a little bit of thin CA and just seal that up a little bit. The needle applicators that come with the CA bottles are a little more handy than just the regular nozzle, but I want to coat this entire hole with thin CA glue. That's going to help reinforce the wood fibers. Even though it's stabilized, it's going to reinforce those on the inside and help us get a little more durable insert mounting position. So we'll hit that with some activator. While we wait for that glue to cure up, I'll move my tailstock back into place, and then we'll be drilling this back out again with the drill bit, just in case there's any bumps or anything, or some shavings or anything that got caught in there with the CA glue. So you can hear as the bit was going through the blank, there were a couple little bumpy things we were catching in there. And I'm just going to double check that that's nice and cured. Now we can go ahead and remove our keyless chuck with the drill bit. As far as installing the insert, what I like to do is throw a little bit of wax on what I'll be using to turn the handle with, and I'll be using the ring turning chuck for this. It's a really good piece I like to use instead of just the regular bottle stopper mandrel. But I'll throw some wax on those threads just in case I get any glue. That way I don't glue the insert to my mandrel. And I'll thread that all the way in. Make sure that wax is coated in there nice. If you're worried about getting any wax on the outside of the insert, just get a little bit of denatured alcohol. on a rag, and then you can clean off that insert and make sure there's no machining oil or any grease or wax in there that's going to prevent a good bond between the wood and the insert. Now I'll be coating the inside of this hole with some thick CA glue. I don't want to put too much in there because there's nowhere for that glue to go. If you press this in and you're near the bottom of the hole, it'll split the blank. So just a light coating is all you need. But what I like to do is I'll use the tailstock actually to push this in. That helps push the insert in nice and straight. Alright, once I get to the end of my bushing, I'm going to loosen up my tailstock and then unthread my bottle stopper chuck, my ring turning chuck. Okay, as you can see, I've set that insert a little bit farther back into the wood than just the face here. The reason for that is the pizza cutter that I'll be putting on this has a really long stud. If you want to mount that flush, you'll just need to grind down the stud that comes with the kit, or you can press the insert in just a little bit further than the edge of the blank there. So, alright, so now we have our handle insert glued in and ready. I just want to sand the face of this and throw a little thin coat of CA on this face here, because once we take this out of the chuck, we're not going to be able to access this anymore. So I'll turn that lathe back on and I'll just sand that face a little bit with some 320. Got a clean surface off of that skew, so I don't need to sand very coarse. And I'm leaving that speed low for sanding. And then I'll hit that up to 600. Alright, the next thing I want to do is seal this end grain here, or this side of this face, with some thin CA glue. That way we have a nice watertight bond across the entire project. So I'll get a little puddle of CA glue on a piece of rag and then just coat that surface. And then just rotate that in there into that drilled hole. And then we'll hit it with a little bit of activator. We'll stop the lathe and take a look. So now this side of the blank is completely sealed with the CA glue. So this is ready to flip around and mount into our ring turning chuck. So if you have a ring turning chuck, you can use it for bottle stoppers, pizza cutters, all those projects that use that 3/8 16 mandrel or stud. If you don't have a ring turning chuck, you can use the bottle stopper mandrel as well. I just like this because I don't have to mount it into a drill chuck or a collet chuck. I can just mount this directly onto the lathe. I've got the bottle stopper bushing on here just to space out my bushings for the depth of how far my insert is in the handle. Depending on how far you push the insert in or out of the blank, you might need to space these out with some extra bushings, or you might not. So for the pizza cutter, I'll be actually using the medium-sized bushing out of the ring turning chuck. I find that with the radius of the handle to the medium bushing to be really good for that kit in particular. So use the appropriate bushing depending on your kit you're turning. So now we can go ahead and thread this straight on. And the nice thing is with that insert in there, I don't have to worry about stripping my threads out. That was a common problem if you just tap the wood directly. You strip the threads out and then your fit's loose. So these inserts have been a game changer in a lot of ways. For as cheap as they are, they definitely enhance your turning projects and make it a lot easier on you when you're turning it as well. So let's bring up our revolving center, and I'll do the same trick that I showed you earlier. I'll turn the lathe on with the tailstock loose. Once my revolving center is engaged, then I'll lock that down and then tighten everything up. That just helps everything stay centered. That's a cool little trick that I didn't know until Dick Singh told me. So now that we're running true, we're between our centers, we can start getting this to shape. The shape I want to do is I'm going to match this profile I had on my pizza cutter I turned earlier. I find it to be a really comfortable ergonomic style, as well as I think the aesthetics of it look really good as well. So I'll actually start on this end here, getting that first radius profile I want, so we can bump our speed up now. We're just a little over 2,000 RPM. Obviously make sure you wear a dust mask, eye protection when you're turning. Use our spindle rough and gouge to start getting the profile we want. I'm going to slide my tool rest over to the left just a little bit so I don't run out of room on this end. Having a stabilized blank definitely helps the turning process. It cuts cleaner, finishes better, and takes detail better as well. You can see that profile starting to come out of the shape now. Now I'm going to move this over to the right a little bit, start getting that concave shape we need. I'm just going to put a pencil line there, that's where I want the end of the handle to be. Once you mark out the end of your blank and you see that first radius start showing up, then you know where to put that concave lowest point in the center. Start getting that taper. I'm going to go to my spindle gouge and start radiusing the end of the handle now. Getting a little chatter, just need to tighten that up a little bit. And because that revolving center leaves a dimple in there, I want to make sure I have a good 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch that I'm going to part away after we get our shape done. That way I don't have a dimple in the end of the blank. I'm going to slide this back over to the left, start getting our final diameter we need here. I've got my spindle rough and gouge rolled over so it's almost a shear scrape to get my radius. And then I can switch to my skew, use it like a negative rake scraper just to get that perfect profile I want here on the end. Alright, now let's remove some more material here on the end. Then we'll use my spindle gouge on the end here. Give myself a little more tool rest. Little catch, make sure you start on the bevel, raise the handle till you cut. And then we can roll that over. Jeez. Those are not smooth. Let me try and get a good one for you. All right, I like that radius we have on the end. Now let's bring up this end of the handle here to match. I'm going to reduce the diameter of that end there as well. I think it's a little big. Just trying to smooth out that contour. A little bit of a high spot right there. Okay, now I'm going to radius the end of the handle end over just a little more. If you're catching, make sure you're on the bevel. All right. Okay, I'm happy with the profile we have and the dimensions. Feels pretty good in the hand, so now I'm just going to use my negative rake scraper just to go over and smooth out any imperfections across the surface. Now stop the lathe and take a look. Alright, so we've got a really good profile here. Nice smooth contour. Make sure it feels good in your hand. I like the radius on the end here. There's a couple little compression marks there from pushing too hard on the bevel. But I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to do a couple more passes with my skew and then we can go ahead and sand this and get it ready for our CA finish. On these final passes with the tool, make sure your tool is nice and sharp. Using a skew with a really sharp radius on the tip has a nice, easy flowing curve, makes it really easy to control. Move my tool rest over just a touch to get the end. Nice smooth curve there. Fill the surface for any ridges. I think from the end to here we're really good. I think there's just a couple little ridges right here in the top half of this convex shape. And just try and work those back and forth and feather those out. Just to smooth that entire surface over. Okay, that feels really smooth. Let's take a look. Okay, you can see how pretty that grain is in that box elder burl. Got a really nice shape to it. The end looks pretty sharp to me. I like this detail line here is nice and crisp, so when we sand it, we want to make sure not to smooth that off or roll that over. We just want to be careful when we're sanding. So let's go ahead and sand. I'm going to move my tool rest out of the way, set my tools off to the side. You can use sheet paper if you like. A drill also works as well. You just have to be careful when you're getting near the bushings, and then making sure that you're not deforming the radius you have on the ends. So let's slow our lathe down. When you're sanding contours like this, I find it a little bit easier to do and maintain my shape with a drill than just the sandpaper. Obviously wear a dust mask whenever you're sanding, when possible. And we want to make sure we sand out any ridges or unsmooth surfaces, because as soon as we put the CA finish on, all those reflective lines you get from light on a CA finish are going to show any imperfections in your surface. So okay, now I'm going to go to my 320. And before I do that, I want to make sure I hit this corner here where the bushing is. I just didn't want to sand it with the drill, so I'm just going to touch that little corner piece with my paper. Alright, so before we get too far into the sanding process, I do want to remove the nub. So what I'll do now is I'll grab my small saw and I'm just going to cut this off. Loosen up the tailstock slightly. And this is just a thin saw you can get at Home Depot. Most woodworking stores or hardware stores have those. Those are a good little tool to have in your toolbox. And the reason I don't want to turn that nub off is because we're so far extended. There's a lot of chatter on this, even with a really smooth bevel riding cut. So usually I'll just cut that off with the saw, and then we can sand the rest of that little nub off while we're still at the 220. I'll move my tailstock as far out of the way as possible. One of our YouTube commenters reminded me to take the revolving center out of the tailstock so I don't run my elbow into it. I've done that a handful of times. It's never a good time. Alright, so revolving center's out of the way now. I'll continue with my 220 grit just to sand that nub down. I'm going to switch to a new piece of 220. That one got a little bit worn out. I think it was a used piece when I started. And then I'll just feather the drill back and forth to maintain that nice smooth radius we have on the end. Alright, now we can jump to our 320. Again, our sanding speed is right about 600 RPM, especially because we're using a drill we don't want to over sand or sand too fast. Alright, I'll set my drill off to the side and we'll finish sanding this with 400 sheet paper. I'm going to bump the speed just a tad, and then I'll make sure I get in the corners. And when I'm sanding with the paper, I want to make sure that I pull from each end of the paper. That way I don't leave any undulations from my fingers. And then I'll use my palm to sand that radius, keep that contour nice and round. And we can stop the lathe and take a look. One last thing to do before we put our CA on is I'm just going to sand this lengthwise, get rid of any of the radial scratches we might have, because those will always show up underneath the CA. And then on the end cap, I kind of just sand across. Try and get rid of any of those swirl marks from the sandpaper we might have. Okay, before we get our CA on, I want to make sure I clean off our lathe bed, clean off the lathe pretty good, get rid of any dust that might get blown onto your workpiece as you're putting the CA on, because we don't want to contaminate the CA finish. I'm also going to wipe this blank down and the bushings off just with some denatured alcohol to strip any of the dust. You can see the dust we have there. We don't want to trap that underneath the CA to make it obscure the wood surface at all. But you can see as soon as we put some DNA on there, that color in the stabilized blank really pops. So just give that a good wipe down. Give it a 20-30 seconds to let the alcohol dry, and then we can start with our first coat of CA. Alright, for our CA finish, I'll be using these blue shop paper towels. The reason I use these is because typically when you use the regular white paper towels, it kicks the CA over on the rag before you can apply it to the entire surface. So the blue rags give you a little more work time because there's less cellulose in the paper towel. So for CA finishes, the blue paper towel is my go-to. And I'll just tear off a small section. And the CA I'll be using, this is just the thin, this is the hot stuff, Satellite City. It's a USA made CA. I find it to be a little more durable than most of the other CAs on the market, and it's very, very clear. But I'll be using the thin. The reason I use the thin is because it'll wick into that surface, give me a good seal coat, and then we'll build up a bunch of thin layers from there. A lot of guys like to use the thick or the pen finish to do that. Me personally, I have more success with the thin because then there's less polishing time after the fact to try and level out the surface to get a good, nice, smooth, glossy surface. So for the CA finish, I'm going to drop my lathe speed down really slow, right? We're about 200 RPM here. If your lathe is spinning too fast, the friction will cause that CA to kick over too fast as well, and then it'll cause your rag to stick to the blank. So I fold this over to where I've got 2 or 3 layers of paper towel. That way it doesn't go through to my finger, but you can always wear gloves if you want. So I'm going to build up a nice little puddle on the rag, and then I'll just be putting a couple drops across the surface as I work it back and forth, making sure I've got enough CA to coat the entire surface. The work time on that is pretty quick, so you do need to move across the surface fairly fast, or you can break it down into smaller chunks and do thirds at a time if you need. So I'm going to tear that piece off, and then I'm just going to hit that with just a light coat of activator. Make sure that kicks over before we put our next coat on. One thing when you're doing CA finishes too, the fumes are pretty nasty, so definitely wear a respirator that's got a carbon filter in it or something to cut down on those fumes, or make sure you have good airflow. Typically I'll have a fan behind me blowing the fumes away and out of the shop, but a couple different ideas for you there. But the process of the CA is basically just going to be doing that same initial coat, but a bunch of times. We're going to try and get 10 coats on here. That way when we go through and polish the surface, we don't cut through our CA and then have to put more coats on. We want to have a thick enough layer that we can polish it out and still have a good shiny CA finish. As far as the activator goes, 8 to 10 inches away, just a quick burst. A lot of times guys will have issues over activating the CA, and then it becomes white and cloudy. So less activator the better. But making sure that your blank is prepped and you're using the right materials when you're putting your CA on is going to give you the best results. Again, just a small puddle on the rag, and then I'll just put a couple of drops on as I go across the surface, making sure to never stay in one spot too long. And I just work that rag back and forth a little bit at a time as I go across the surface. And you can see we're already getting a really good gloss. If I stop the lathe, you can see just how much it enhances the color that's already in the wood, makes everything a nice rich color, and that's going to be a really pretty handle when we're done. So we'll turn that back on, just give it a quick burst of CA. If you do get a little bit of CA on your fingers, a little bit of acetone will wipe that off, no problem. But right now we have about 3 coats on there. I'm going to shoot for 10. The other day I did a 7-coat one, and I sanded through a little bit of a little section of the blank, and I had to put more coats on, so I'm going to go to 10 this time. A couple extra drops, make sure you get the end of the blank, and just try and smooth that out. The nice thing about the thin, the reason I use it, is because it lays down nice and flat, and there's less ridges to sand out once we get into the polishing steps. So for me, that's why I like the thin. Alright, so we have 4 coats on. We'll just skip through to our 10th coat, and I'll show you what it looks like after we have 10 coats on. Alright, so we're going to put on our final coat. This is our 10th or 11th coat here. Again, just pull that and then put a couple drops on. Use that rag to smooth out the CA as it lays out. And then I'll hit this one more coat of activator. I'll let this set up. I'll give it just a few minutes to fully cure. If you wanted to, you could let this sit for a couple hours and just make sure everything's completely cured up before we go to polish it out. But we should be fine here. So the next step, if we stop the lathe, you can see that the CA is almost perfectly level, but there are a little bit of ridges here and there from the rag and the CA as it kind of laid out and cured. So we've got a really good finish on there, a good durable layer. The polishing process I'm about to show you is really where you take a regular CA finish up to the next level, because you want to be able to have this at any light, not have any ridges, and be completely smooth and glossy like it's got a coat of glass on the outside. So the first thing I want to do is we'll sand this with 600 grit, and we'll see what the high points and low points of our finish are, and then I'll show you how to level those out with the sandpaper. Alright, for the initial leveling process, I'll be using the Abernet. This is the 600 grit. The reason I use this is so it doesn't clog up and then I can clean it out. And I also have a cup of water here to help lubricate the surface and keep the sandpaper from clogging as we sand. So I'm going to stop the lathe and I'm going to sand this lengthwise. And I'm grabbing each end of the paper and pulling that straight across. That way it disperses the amount of pressure on the paper across a wider surface area and is going to help us level our CA finish out better. Reason I started with 600 is I don't want to remove a bunch of CA on the surface. I just want to try and refine it. If it starts clogging on you, just dip it in the paper, or sorry, dip it in your cup of water, and then your sandpaper is almost like it's brand new again. I try not to sand one area for too long because I don't want to cut through the CA back to the wood. And then I'll use my palm to just sand around the end there. Up and down, side to side, and then I try to go on a 45 there. And what I'll do now is I'll get a little piece of paper towel. And once the surface is dry, you'll be able to see the dull areas where we've sanded, and then the shiny areas that are the low spots in the finish that still need to be sanded. So it gives you a good visual reference as to where you've sanded and where you haven't, and where you still need to level out. So I don't know if it's picking it up on camera, but as I rotate that, there's shiny areas and dull areas. So those are the high and low spots. Anything that's matte finish has been sanded. Anything that's shiny still is the low area that hasn't been sanded. So you can see there's a bunch of ridges in there that we still need to sand out. This is kind of the tedious part of the whole process, but to me the results are well worth the effort, especially on a blank like this or a piece like Koa, where you have a bunch of high figure and you really want to emphasize the chatoyancy of the wood and pop the grain and make it look just like $1,000,000. And as you do this process more often, it does become quicker. Your first couple times will probably take a while just to get that perfect glossy surface. But once you've done it a bunch of times, it's a lot easier and you can recognize those high and low areas a lot quicker and know exactly where to sand. I'm making sure not to sand over the edge of that transition between the outside radius and this front concave area. If you sand, it's easy to over sand that and go right down to the bare wood. So I'm trying to make sure to stop right at that corner. If you do happen to sand through the CA in a certain spot, you can always go ahead and put a couple more coats right back over just that one area and seal that back up and give you a nice good layer because the CA will bond to itself. So that's the one good thing about CA is you can always refinish and add CA on top of CA, and it bonds really well to itself. Let's get my dry paper towel and wipe this off and see where the low spots still are. Okay, so this section of the handle is looking pretty good. Having a good shop light is extremely handy, so you can see the high areas and the low areas. Makes it a little bit easier to identify. Good shop light's always a good thing to have. So this is all looking pretty good. I've got some shiny areas right in this section here. Let's go ahead and sand those. One thing that helps too is kind of cross-hatching your sandpaper. So I'm going to go this direction, then I'm going to go this direction and an X. That helps cut through it a little bit better. Let's wipe that off and take a look and see if we got through that. Okay, there's a little bit right here. There's a tiny bit right here. The end piece I definitely need to sand more. I think this is all good right in here. So I think just right about here is all we need to do left. Let's flip that edge of the paper over and we can sand the end cap. This is where it's really nice to have headphones in when you're in your shop, because you can just put on some good music and just crack away at your project and do a bunch of these handles for Christmas gifts or anything like that. The nice thing about a finish like this though is when you have it on your craft display table or something, if you're trying to sell these handles, they photograph really well with the high gloss, as well as they just show up really well when you're out at your craft show booth. The sunlight hits those and just makes the wood pop. Okay, I've got one ridge right here and I have a little bit more shiny areas just on the end. Gonna kind of cross hatch that there. And then there's just a tiny little ridge here. Just spot sand that. Same thing on the end cap. I'm going to use my thumb just to cut just that single area. Okay, let's wipe this down one more time. I'm going to get a dry rag. Okay, so the entire surface, except for just a teeny little piece here, I'll sand one more time, is nice and matte. That means we have a good level surface that we can then polish out. And it doesn't look like we've gone through the CA to the bare wood, so that's good. Sometimes as you get through those polishing steps, you will sand through the finish, but I can show you how to touch that up if that happens to us. So I'm going to hit just these little end pieces here, and then we'll be ready to move on to the polishing. Okay, so for my first initial step, I'll be using the Merlon. This is a 2500 grit non-woven abrasive pad. I'll also be sanding with this wet. This 2500 gives me a good step between the 600 and the scratch free that we'll be using next. So I'll just dip that a little bit in water. The nice thing is the water helps keep the CA finished surface nice and cool. And I don't want to sand in any one spot for too long or I'll go through my finish, even with that 2500 grit. But that non-woven pad helps get rid of any circular scratch marks, as well as that 2500 grit is a really good step between the two, that 600 and the scratch free. This stuff's always also really good for polishing lathe beds. Helps your pieces, your tailstock and your banjo move nice and smooth across the surface as well. So I always keep a bunch of these on hand. Okay, and then I'll just go back and forth just in case I do have any radial scratches. Just sand it lengthwise. It's good practice. And that is ready to polish out now. So we'll be doing the scratch free as our first step, then we'll be doing the micro magic for the 3-step polishing system. And then from there, if you want to use the pen buff, you can do that as well, or just be done with it, because the gloss after the 3 steps is going to be really high. So for polishing, I'm going to bump my lathe speed back up to about 2,500 RPM. So I'm going to get a clean section of paper towel. I'm going to put a decently heavy coat of wax on there, and then just slowly let that melt onto the surface and distribute the abrasive paste across the surface. Now I'm going to get just a little bit more on the rag, and now I'm going to start applying friction and start polishing this out. And you can see that gloss has already started to increase. I'll use my palm for the end. Get a little more abrasive paste. Make sure you sand all the way down into the corner, and if you polish your bushings there, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so if I stop the lathe and take a look, you can see that scratch free has definitely refined the surface. Now we can move on to our 3-step polishing compounds. Alright, so I have my 3-step waxes here. I'm going to start with the red. Get a decent amount of wax on there. And when you're using this wax, make sure you use paper towels in small pieces. It does have a microcrystalline wax in it, so it's really sticky. And a lot of times it'll pull the rag out of your hands. So make sure you use a small piece of paper towel and not cloth. But you can see just bumping from the scratch free to that next step in the red, it's already increased the gloss by quite a lot. Get just a little more wax on there. I'm going to get a clean section of rag now and just buff off any excess wax or grit from the previous compound before we move on. Now we'll go on to the white. And you can see that really increased the shine. I'm just looking at the reflection of the lights in here, and it's getting shinier and shinier with every step, and that's what we're looking for. Get a clean section of rag and just buff off any of that grit. I'm going to use the back side of that now, and I'll go on to the blue in our final step. And that gloss is looking really good now. Let's stop the lathe and take a look. Alright, so if I stop the lathe and take a look, I'm moving my head around to get different light angles on the piece and see if there's any imperfections in the surface. And I can see there's a teeny little ridge right here. And if I rotate it around, I can see it. Yeah, there's a little ridge right here. And there was another one just back here. So before I take this off the lathe, I'm actually going to go back to my non-woven abrasive. I'm just going to sand this out just a little bit, spot sand these areas, and then we can repolish that again. This is where you want to double check your work and make sure you're completely level, because you don't want to go through all these polishing steps and then find out you have some imperfections and you take it off the lathe. Fortunately, with the inserts, you can remount these pretty easy, but I definitely want to make this surface perfect. Get a dry section rag to wipe the water off so you can see. There it is. And if you need to, if the ridges are bad enough that the 2500 isn't taking them out, you can always jump back down to the 600. Okay, it looks like it's got rid of that ridge there, so I'm just going to go back through my grits one more time. That's the scratch-free, clean section of rag. Wipe that away. Go back to my red. Fortunately, we didn't sand through the CA anywhere. There's been a bunch of times where I've sanded through in certain areas that just had a ridge that was just not coming out and I had to sand through it. So a lot of times as well, I'll keep the rags that have wax on them and just wipe them on the lathe bed just to help keep the lathe bed waxed as well, so that way they're not going to waste. Flip that over to a clean side. Then we're back to our final grit. You can also do the same thing with the micro mesh pads, micro surface finishing pads. Those are really handy. I prefer the wax myself. Let's go ahead and stop the lathe and we'll see how our finish looks and give it a good inspection here. Just wipe this down with a clean rag. Alright, I think that surface looks really good. Double check the end there. A lot of times that's overlooked. I'm going to unscrew this, take it off the lathe, and give it a good inspection and some light. Alright, you can see just how good a gloss we got on there. And we have a really nice durable finish. And this thing, you can either go to a pen buff if you wanted to get a little bit glossier surface, or you can go ahead and mount this right onto your project piece. So let's get our pizza cutter out, we'll install it, and then this handle will be done. Alright, so we've got our project handle done. I'm going to thread my pizza cutter in. The other nice thing about those inserts too is when I take this off to wash it, the threads will still be good. We'll screw that in, give everything a good wipe down, try and get rid of any fingerprints. I've still got a little bit of wax residue on my hands. But that is a really good CA finish on a project handle. So hopefully you guys learned some tips and tricks for doing a CA finish on a larger scale project. These same tips can be applied to doing pens, other projects, bottle stoppers, vegetable peelers, coffee scoops, stuff like that. But I think it's really worth the effort to do a finish like that on a pizza cutter when you're trying to sell it at a premium price. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos. If you guys have any questions, drop them in the comments below. But we'll see you on the next video.